Hi, and welcome to the Judincast. This is for Social 10-1, episode 20, where we're going to look at the politics of resource development. And this will conclude Chapter 13. Chapter 13 focuses on the impacts of globalization on the environment. And there will be one more chapter of our unit on sustainability, which is Chapter 14. So far, you hopefully have got an idea that globalization does have an impact on the environment, that no longer are resources locally extracted and locally consumed. Now, because of economic globalization and the interconnectedness of our global economy, that there are demands for local resources. So whether if you look at Canada and our production of oil, production of timber, that these are things that are in demand around the world. And so globalization itself does have an impact on the environment because of this close relationship that countries around the world have in terms of the exchange of goods and resources, etc. So we looked primarily at the oil industry, and you got to look at some positives and negatives of that last time. And of course, there's tons of positive economic benefits, and there's obviously negatives on the environment. So let's look at the politics of resource development, is what the chapter calls this section. And of course, this, as anything, is related to globalization. So if you consider resources, whether it's water, soil, trees, forest, coal, petroleum, natural gas, various types of minerals, wildlife as a resource, should land be left in its natural state? Should we leave it as forest, wetlands, deserts? Or should it be cleared, drained, irrigated to make room for roads, homes, farms? Now, this is the ongoing debate. And of course, there's a bit of a balancing act because human society requires things to be in its natural state, but it also requires the area to be cleared for irrigation, for farms, for the establishment of homes, the building of roads, etc. So it's a complicated process. And if you consider the Amazon, now you guys have all probably heard that the Amazon is decreasing in its size every day. And of course, the Amazon plays a very important role for the planet. But there's a very big debate going on in Brazil and to what extent the Amazon should be. Now, apparently, the stat for the Amazon is 20% of the world's oxygen is a result of the Amazon rainforest. Now, that's obviously of great benefit to people or other organisms on the planet. But why is the Amazon disappearing? Well, the Amazon is actually disappearing because it's being cleared to make room for farming. That is the major contributor to the disappearance of the Amazon, to clear room for cows and other types of livestock to graze on, which have economic benefits. Farming produces economic benefits. It feeds the population as well. So it's a tricky balancing act that society will certainly have to try to address. And this is, of course, connected to globalization because there are demands for these products from all over the world. And countries will perhaps clear their forests, their wetlands, etc., in order to meet these demands. And if you look at less developed countries, now Canada is a developed country, but Brazil is a less developed country. And I'm just going to give you an example of resource development in a less developed country, and that's Borneo. And I'm going to use Borneo because it's in a textbook. But there's countless examples of the situation all around the world, hundreds and hundreds of them. But let's look at Borneo. So Borneo has undergone a great degree of deforestation. So that means the removal of forests. And the primary motivator behind that is the desire to make room for palm oil plantations. Now, palm oil is in high demand around the world. There's a demand in every country around the world generally for palm oil. Palm oil is a cooking oil. It can be used for various other methods as well, but primarily as a cooking oil. Now, they're clearing this to meet the demand of the global marketplace. Borneo is a relatively small country. They have enough palm oil for themselves, but they're clearing forest to meet global demand. So this is a very strong connection between the resource development and negative effects on the environment and the global economic system. Now, the cost of this is that this destroys the natural habitat for millions of species. But the positive, it creates economic growth for Borneo. It creates jobs. It leads to taxes for the government. And this is just like European countries did in the 19th and 20th century. That this was an important step to try to industrialize their societies, expand the middle class, and that it starts with developing their resources. So, should less developed countries now should they stop this? Is a kind of a question to think about. Should they be allowed to continue with this type of development to try to work their economies up to more advanced economies? Again, it's a tricky issue, but it shows you the connection between resource development and environment. Another impact on the environment is urbanization. Now, urbanization is the conversion of rural land. So rural land is land outside of a city to urban space. Only 20% of the population in the world's most developed regions will not be urbanized in the future. And I believe that's pretty. I think it's not quite there yet, but it's very close. And here's a stat for you. In more developed regions such as Canada, 80% of people are in urban areas. Less developed regions, 49%. And this is going up and up and up and up and up. Both these are creeping upwards. You can see that there's an increase. Now, the problem here is cities explode. And cities require a lot of resources to keep them in essentially livable places. And there's no resources in cities. We don't farm in cities. We don't produce food. We don't produce other types of material and resources generally. So resources that cities depend on are imported from rural regions in less developed regions, primarily. So this raises many concerns about the environment. If you think about urban areas, that there's poor air and water quality in cities, it could be insufficient water availability. Water will have, of course, has to be moved in. Waste disposal problems, high energy consumption, and this is exacerbated by increasing population density and demands of urban environments. So cities depend on a certain amount of, they depend on food, they depend on energy, and other things imported from rural areas. So again, shows you some of the implications of economic expansion. So to wrap things up, let's just look at resource development agreements and environmental legislation. So first, let's look at some resource development agreements. So many resource development agreements began as negotiations between a corporation that wants to develop a resource and a government that controls the land where the resource is found. However, there rarely are two stakeholders involved in resource development agreement. There's usually many more levels. So one or more groups may object to the development of a resource for economic, environmental, social, political, or cultural reasons. Two or more competing corporations might lobby the government for exclusive rights to develop the resource. So international organizations or other countries might try to stake a claim in resource development negotiation. And the best example of this is the ongoing pipeline discussions that you guys, of course, have heard on the news constantly because it's always in the news in Alberta, pipelines. Pipelines are a complicated thing. They're very much related to resource development. There's many different stakeholders. Why is there struggles to get pipelines built? Well, that's because one or more groups may object to the development of resource for various reasons. Whether it's provincial governments, Aboriginal cultural groups, federal government, etc. There's many different stakeholders involved, or different corporations that are involved, labor unions, etc. So resource development agreements can certainly be complex. And this is, of course, related to our topic of resource development agreements. And in a globalized economy, there's even more stakeholders involved, of course. OPEC, another example of a resource development agreement. So some resource development agreements are negotiated not between corporations and governments, but by the governments of many countries of common interest. And OPEC is a great example of this. So OPEC was formed in 1960 and was formed to regulate oil production and markets. Today, there's 11 members that control much of the world's oil. By agreeing about levels of oil production, OPEC countries control the supply for the world's demand of oil. This often causes prices to increase or decrease. Now, if you have a lot of people like to complain, of course, about the price of oil, like the Canadian government or the provincial government has something to do with that. That is not the case generally. And the reason, if you want to blame somebody for why the price of oil is too high or it's too low, you should look at OPEC, because OPEC controls generally over 70% of oil produced. So if they want to increase the price of oil, well, they have to just decrease supply. If they want to lower the price of oil, they just increase supply. And this is a resource development agreement that allows countries that are part of OPEC to work together to try to essentially control the price of oil. Many people consider it a cartel. Alberta, Canada, United States were not part of OPEC. These are the OPEC countries right here. Most of them are in the Middle East. So let's just quickly look at some environmental legislation. So as a global community, we have begun to recognize that all our actions have an impact on the environment, not just locally, but worldwide. Organizations and legislation now approach resources and the natural environment as a whole, rather than as separate parts divided by national boundaries. So local, national, global environmental legislation can help keep countries focused on sustainable development. Sustainable development, of course, means being able to grow economically while not destroying the environment. So as with all types of legislation, however, environmental laws can be very controversial. Environmental agreements and legislation must be created to reflect a variety of perspectives, and the challenge of addressing all of them can create lengthy processes, tension among stakeholders, and even increased illegal activities. Stakeholders may object to environmental legislation for many reasons. Consider this example. Environmental laws in Canada could prevent a company from dumping waste into a freshwater lake. The company will then have to pay or dispose of the waste in a more environmentally sound way, so it's going to cut into their profits. Competing company in a country where environmental standards do not prevent dumping of waste into freshwater lakes, a lot of developing countries, for example, doesn't have to pay the extra cost of disposing of its waste, and so it may have an economic advantage. So again, this ties back to globalization, that Canadian companies are in competition with countries around the world. And if a Canadian government wants to protect the environment, well, there's the consideration of the competition that these companies are involved in. So let's look at the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This was created in 1982, and this gave all countries the right to fish on the high seas, as shown on the blue. But coastal countries such as Canada were given, the high seas are the area shown on white here, so beyond our coast. But coastal countries, so that means any country that has a coast, such as Canada, were given an exclusive economic zone of 200 miles. That means within 200 miles of the coast, they are allowed entirely to fish there. That's the land and area in which they have economic control of. Canadian officials have no authority to regulate stocks behind the boundary of the EEZ, behind the exclusive economic zone. However, they can regulate how much is fished within their zone. This is their zone. They can determine who's fishing and how much they're fishing. And this is in environmental legislation. And it's also an international agreement because this is mandated by the United Nations Law of the Sea. Still, there's some issues. Fish obviously can move freely in the ocean, and by 1990, low fish stocks were seen in the Atlantic. Canada set quotas to conserve fish stocks, but huge international fishing trawlers operated just beyond the 200-mile lines with no restrictions. So even though Canada limited how much fish was being fished with the goal of preserving fish, trawlers would come just right outside the 200-mile area or 320-kilometer area, and they would fish. So despite Canada's efforts, they were seeing not the positive effect they wanted. So the United Nations stepped things up with the agreement on straddling and highly migratory fish stocks. This agreement addresses sustainability, conservation, fishing quotas, international waters. Each country's right to protect its EEZs and a legal means of enforcing the agreement, and it's a process for settling disputes. So if there's disputes in terms of fishing too close to the exclusive economic zone, well, this is an international global effort to try to mediate those disputes and try to preserve international fish stock. So another great example of political globalization, of countries working together to address global issues. Just a couple other things here before I wrap it up in terms of international agreements, environmental legislation. You have the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna. This is signed on March 3rd, 1973. The goal of this is to protect and discourage people from capturing endangered species and plants for trading. So it's an international global effort to try to preserve plants and animals that are considered endangered. We also have one of the first major environmental legislations in terms of climate change, which of course is a very serious and real issue in more recent years. So the Kyoto Protocol was the first attempt to try to address climate change. So it's an international agreement aimed at reducing emissions of greenhouse gases to curb climate change. Now, of course, the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere leads to the trapping of heat and the progressive warming of the planet, which can have potentially very bad effects. With the Kyoto Protocol, more than 150 countries signed, including Canada. It required more developed countries to achieve the bulk reduction. So they're essentially agreeing to reduce a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions. United States, Australia refused to sign. Some countries were successful with the Kyoto Protocol. Canada wasn't. A lot of other countries weren't. More recently, the Kyoto Protocol was removed and it was replaced by the Paris Agreement in 2016, which is another environmental legislation that is a global effort to try to reduce greenhouse gas emission. I think every country signed it except for the United States. I believe they're the only one because they have their reasons of national interest why they don't want to be part of this global effort. So that's it for this chapter on environmental impacts of globalization and resource development and environmental legislation, etc. In chapter 14, we'll be looking at sustainability. So how can we have a society that's sustainable? That means there's economic prosperity and there's also the potential to preserve and protect the environment. So that's it for today, guys. Take care.